Hi everyone, welcome in. We're going to get started in just a minute. All right, looks like some people are still trickling in, but we can go ahead and just get started. Before we introduce our speakers for today, we're just going to start with a few technical reminders especially for those who may not be as familiar with Zoom webinars. So we'll be using the Q&A function. So if any questions come up for the presenters during their presentation, you can go ahead and use this box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions about their presentation, their work, their research, and we'll have a facilitated Q&A session at the end of this webinar. You can also use this box for any technical questions that come up. And with that, I will pass it over to my colleague Melanie to get us started.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are joining us from. I am Melanie Chitray, and together with Giselle Medina, we will be assisting to facilitate today's webinar. We welcome you and thank you for taking the time to join this GFRA webinar. Today, we have two presenters, Dr. Mclaws and Ahmadi, and it is my pleasure to introduce them to you. So Dr. Mclaws is a veterinarian with a PhD in epidemiology. Her experience on FMD started in 2001 when she worked as a field epidemiologist during the large outbreak in the UK. Since then, she has worked as an epidemiologist in international organizations as well as for provincial and national governments in Canada. She is currently working for the FAO to support risk assessment and management of transboundary animal diseases and is the FAO co-chair for the GFTAD's FMD working group. Dr. Ahmadi is a veterinarian, agricultural economist, and policy analyst with a PhD. Currently, he's the coordinator of the GFTAD's Global Secretariat at FAO. He focuses on transboundary animal diseases, collaborating with organizations like the WOAH and regional economic communities. Together, they will be presenting on the risk of foot and mouth disease, SAT2 introduction and spread in countries in the Near East and West Eurasia. Dr. Mclaws and Ahmadi, thank you for accepting the GFRA's invitation for this webinar, and we look forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Melanie, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. Let me try to share my screen, or not try, let me share my screen. Share. Are you seeing it correctly?
Yes.
Somebody confirm? Okay, great. So thank you very much to the organizers for having us today. It's a real pleasure. And we're going to share with you some work that we did last year about an assessment of the risk of SAT2 introduction and spread in countries in Near East and West Eurasia. So this is a brief standard outline for the presentation. I'm going to start with some background and describing the methods, particularly for the likelihood assessment, and then I'll give you the results of that assessment. And then I'll hand over to Bouda who will present on the consequences as well as share some recommendations and conclusions. Before I go further, I would like to acknowledge the many people who helped us or participated in this work. First of all, we have co-authors, many of whom are with FAO, Kiko, Mohammed, Andri, Fabrizio, and Madur, and also two non-FAO colleagues who assisted us, Roberto Condoleo, who's with an institute in Italy, and Georgina Limon. We were also fortunate to have a number of expert contributors and reviewers, and their names are listed here, and they really provided very helpful comments and perspectives for this analysis. And finally, to the veterinary services from the countries who completed the questionnaire, and the assistance that we got from the FAO regional and sub-regional offices in Europe and the Near East. So I think that most people in this audience will be aware that FMD areas have been divided into virus pools, and you can see them represented on this map here. And this is something that's been done to help us control FMD. Within each virus pool, there's usually common serotypes and strains that are circulating, and the animals are thought to have some kind of connections with each other, either through proximity or through trade routes. And so this helps with making vaccination decisions, for example. We're going to be focusing our work today in FMD virus pool 3, where the usual endemic situation is that 3 serotypes, O, A, and Asia 1, circulate. And within this pool 3, there's different levels of FMD outbreaks. And in December 2022, there was an increase in FMD outbreaks noted in both Iraq and Jordan. And those outbreaks in Jordan were initially attributed to serotype O, because Jordan had been responding to outbreaks of serotype O for the past year or so. So this was the situation in December 2022. And eventually samples from Iraq were transported and tested in Turkey, in the SHAP Institute in Turkey, through the laboratory network in that region. And SAT2 serotype was detected in that analysis, and those results were shared on the 3rd of February. This was closely followed on the 5th of February with media reports from Jordan that were eventually confirmed by the veterinary services. And then subsequent reports in other countries followed, as you can see on the timeline. The analysis revealed that this was topotype 14, which was most closely related to a strain that had been detected in Ethiopia in 2022. So again, probably most people in this call are aware that the SAT2 serotype usually only circulates in Africa. And so the animals in West Eurasia and the Near East in the pool 3 are going to be fully susceptible to infection by this serotype, because they've never been exposed, neither through vaccination nor through any type of maternal immunity or previous immunity. SAT2 had spread outside of sub-Saharan Africa before. Notably in 2012, there was a large outbreak of SAT2 in Egypt and Libya. And it had also spread previously into the Middle East. It was detected in Yemen in 1990, in Saudi Arabia in the year 2000, and in 2012, it also was in Bahrain and the Gaza Strip. So as I mentioned before, this detection of SAT2 was of high concern. It was causing a lot of outbreaks, likely because the animals were lacking immunity, and the vaccines typically used in the region would have no protection for this serotype. The immediate response by FAO was to issue an alert on the 10th of February to encourage countries to enhance their preparation for a potential incursion and further spread. For the countries in the region, we held a series of 3 webinars in March of that year, and those were widely open to anybody who wanted to participate. So it wasn't limited to the vet services, but also to any interested stakeholders. And in those webinars, we gave an update on the situation. We had a dedicated webinar to laboratory diagnostics to detect this new serotype. And we had a 3rd dedicated webinar about risk management and vaccination strategies. And those webinars were very well attended and received. In addition to those big public meetings, there was also a series of coordination meetings held between the vet services of the different countries in that region, and those were coordinated by EUFMD and the FAO regional office. And finally, on request of the Iraqi authorities, there was an emergency mission to Iraq the following June to help them manage the response. So there was a lot of concern at this time about the potential for further spread, and to address this, risk assessment was done to estimate both the likelihood and the consequences of further spread. And that's what the remainder of the presentation is going to be about. Now, there's 2 types of risk assessment. The risk assessment can be qualitative or quantitative. So qualitative is more of a descriptive type analysis, whereas the quantitative tries to put numbers and to assign probabilities to the analysis. In this situation, the qualitative approach was used, and this is most appropriate because it allows for a more rapid analysis. And it also recognized that there's really a lack of reliable hard data to inform a quantitative type analysis. The steps that are followed were standard steps for risk assessment, and I'm going to go through them in a little bit more detail in the subsequent slides. First, we defined the risk questions and the scope of the assessment. And then we decided which risk pathways were most relevant, and we sketched those out. And based on the risk pathways, we collected the data that we required for the analysis. And for this, we had a questionnaire to the veterinary services that was distributed in April of 2023. We also looked through the literature for relevant data to inform some of the steps. And we used databases, particularly FAOStat, which had a lot of interesting data about the trade connections between the different countries. And then following this, we conducted the assessment, and I'll describe the likelihood aspect of it to you. And then Bouda did economic impact modeling using 5 different scenarios, which he'll describe in his part of the presentation. So for the risk questions, now this is a really key part of the steps of the process to define exactly what which questions you're trying to answer. So in this case, the risk questions were: what is the likelihood of FMD susceptible livestock in unaffected countries being exposed to the FMD serotype SAT2 due to the introduction from affected countries via the specified pathways? So within a risk assessment using the WOA framework, we separate between the entry and exposure assessments. And exposure means that the entry really stops at the border once the pathogen enters the country, whereas exposure means that a susceptible livestock actually encounters that pathogen, which of course in this case is foot-and-mouth disease virus. And then the second risk question is: what is the potential impact of that exposure? First of all, in unaffected countries, and also in countries that are already affected. So the likelihood question really focuses on the unaffected countries, whereas the affected countries are also included in the impact assessment. And we included 21 countries in this assessment, and you can see them in the list here. And they were countries with a contiguous land border with affected countries at the time of the analysis. I think notably, some FMD-free European countries were included in the analysis: Bulgaria, Cyprus, and Greece, as well as countries in the Gulf region and this other region that you can see represented in the map, spreading from Israel and going all the way through to the Gulf. You can see these maps, the red color represents the livestock density. On the left, we have the cattle density or large ruminant density, and you can see that there's not so many large ruminants in the region compared to quite a high density of small ruminants, which is the map on the right. For the risk pathways, we considered 6 different risk pathways, which we decided based on the epidemiology of FMD and the different routes of transmission, as well as previously identified ways in which FMD can spread between countries based on other outbreaks. So the 6 pathways are listed here. They include the movement of live animals between countries, which encompasses legal and informal trade, as well as common grazing. We had legal and informal trade in products of animal origin, most notably the meat and milk of susceptible animals. Movement of wildlife between countries, of susceptible wildlife, particularly wild boar. Movements of people between countries, if they're connected by tourism or by workers, for example. Trade in fodder, which is food for livestock, particularly dried hay and straw. And finally, the movements of vehicles between countries. And one of the key things that we did in order to conduct the livelihood or likelihood assessment was to create this matrix that shows the country connections between the different countries included in the analysis. So on the top here, we have let me try a laser pointer. So here we have the movement from, and here we have the movement to. And you can see that just where the cells are completed, it means that there's a connection between those 2 countries. The red responses means that we got the information from the questionnaire, and so it's really pertinent for the time frame that we're focusing on in the analysis. And the black data came from FAO stat. And I think the key messages here is that there's a lot of connections between the countries, and some countries, particularly these Gulf countries, are really highly connected. For example, the UAE has some kind of connection with almost every country in the region. So for each risk pathway, we outlined, defined, and described the major steps. And we have, as I said before, both entry and exposure were considered on a type of continuum. And then for each country and pathway, we described the steps and determined the overall likelihood according to one of 4 levels. The likelihood of the pathway being completed to the end. And the final step was always that the susceptible animal was infected with the SAT2 serotype. The 4 levels were considered negligible, low, moderate, and high. And we also assessed uncertainty on a 3-point scale: low, moderate, or high. And I think because this is a conditional pathway, in order for this following step to occur, the step before has to be completed. The overall likelihood of this pathway cannot be any greater than the least likely step. So that's how we assign the likelihood to each one of the pathways. Shifting now to the results, we had a 71% response rate to the questionnaire. So 15 countries completed the questionnaire. And the main result was that the most likely pathway for FMD spread was overall in the countries was the informal movements of livestock and common grazing, which was estimated to be high for 3 countries or territories, or moderate for another 3 countries and territories. And this is likely coming as no surprise to you, because live animal movements lead to direct contact between susceptible and infected animals, which is a very effective mode of transmission. And these informal movements and common grazing are happening in the absence of any type of sanitary measures that would mitigate the risk of that spread. I think it's notable that this risk or this likelihood wouldn't be a constant likelihood, but that it would vary over time, with peaks, especially around festivals such as the Kurban or the Eid al-Adha, the festival of the sacrifice, and also in conjunction with seasonal movements for grazing patterns. However, because we're dealing mostly with informal movements and common grazing, there's not a lot of hard data to underpin this. And so we do recognize that there's a high level of uncertainty in the assessment. Another pathway which is interesting is about the animal products. And overall, the likelihood was determined in most countries to be less likely compared to the animal movements. And this is because you can see the pathway here is longer. More steps have to be completed in order for this final outcome to be realized. And so although you saw in that matrix that the countries are very highly connected by trade, for this pathway to be completed, often pigs need to be involved through the products that are moved into the country, for example, being used as feed for animals through garbage feeding or swill feeding for pigs. And in this particular region, there's very little pig production. And I think for that reason, this pathway often rated lower for most of the countries. There can also be exposure through scavenging animals being exposed to leftovers. But even in several of the countries, there's no wild boar, so even this is less likely. So I think that this is my last slide before I hand over to Bouda. And this chart estimates the likelihood estimates for all of the different pathways that we investigated. And you can see that the other pathways that I didn't discuss about wildlife, fodder, people and vehicles, in some cases the risk isn't negligible, but it's much less likely. It's usually rated as low. The shading in this pathway indicates either the level of uncertainty. So a blue shading indicates that there's high uncertainty, and the green shading is a moderate uncertainty. So we're more confident about the analysis. And so there are, several data gaps, and we recognize that. But we still think that this assessment and describing these risk pathways should be helpful to the risk managers. And yeah, we'll discuss that later on in the presentation. And now I'd like to thank everybody for listening to me, and I'll hand over to Bouda.
Thanks very much, Melissa. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues across the world. So I continue the presentation by looking at consequences of SAT2 incursion. As Melissa explained, this was a qualitative risk assessment. And maybe Melissa, you can click on there are some animations here. Please complete them. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. So basically, I wanted to remind about the objectives here, which was assessing the likelihood of further spread of SAT2 from those countries affected in the region via different risk pathways that Melissa just explained. And then potential consequences. Although it was not a quantitative risk assessment, we decided to look at a range of potential economic consequences that the region may expect. Before that, I just wanted to remind everyone here basically about the impact of diseases on basically inefficiencies of production. Livestock keepers use their animals and very many other resources to produce products and services, which eventually it goes as values to the consumers or the household themselves. And diseases basically interrupt this process by direct and indirect impact. A direct impact, as is visible in the right-hand side of this slide, can be divided into visible losses and invisible losses. The visible losses, basically, we can notice them and we can measure them, such as production loss, the loss of milk production, loss of drought cover or lower weight gain, and also dead animals, of course. And invisible losses could be much difficult to estimate or to measure, such as impact on fertility, which needs much more data and analysis in a longer term, and also change in the structure of the farm, as well as delay in sale of animals and animal products. And then we will have indirect losses, as we all know, such as additional cost of control, such as vaccination or vaccine delivery and movement control, as well as diagnostic tests. And in some cases, we have compensation for the culled animals. So these are all under additional cost, and they are indirect or consequential cost of the disease. And then we have also revenue foregone as a result of not having the animals on the farm, or having the animals but with much less efficiency. And also the denied access to the market, both at the local and international markets, could be considered as indirect impact. Next slide, please. So here we have included, basically it was a rapid risk assessment, qualitative risk assessment. We decided to be more abstract in here because of the time and also limitation in terms of resources and data that we had. So we looked only at mortality rate as well as reduced productivity, in this case, meat, milk, and hide of these animals in the region. So as Melissa alluded to, we have used FAO stat data and for animal production, and looking at the industries across these 21 countries from 2016 to 2021. We basically look at their production capacities and how much of these products they produce. So here on the right-hand side, you can see as an example, the median and standard deviation of cattle raw milk production in these countries. And as you see on the left-hand side, we have a number of highly productive countries, such as Anatolia region in Turkey. Turkey was the special case because we have Anatolia, which was endemic in terms of FMD, and then we have Thrace region, which is free of FMD with vaccination. And then we have countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Azerbaijan, Israel. They are coming next, and they are having substantial milk production. So the impact on these countries of SAT2 could be quite important to consider. Next slide, please. So as Melissa mentioned, we considered 5 scenarios here to consider. First, if there is no further spread of the disease, only the impact on those 4 countries were estimated. And then the second one, what if the disease spreads westward to the FMD-free countries? And then third one, eastward spread was considered to countries neighboring Anatolia region. And the fourth scenario, spread to countries neighboring Iraq was considered. And then as a worst case scenario, we decided to look at what will be the potential impact of if all those countries are affected. Of course, we would have needed to have a much better estimation about the impact, about the spread, the rate of the spread among the population of each of these countries. And as you can imagine, this would need much more detailed data. However, we tried to use a simulation in Monte Carlo, let's say, framework, which allows for variability of the input parameters. However, we have not included any uncertainty, such as the probability of incursion in each of these countries, which would have needed much more epidemiological insight and perhaps specific epidemiological modeling. Next slide, please. So to show you the results here on the left-hand side, we have a graph demonstrating the impact in terms of the cost in billions US dollars as a result of these incursion in these 5 scenarios. So for scenario 1, as you see, the expected losses would be around 3.6 billion in those 4 countries, based on the data they provided in terms of how the disease is spread in those countries. But then the impact could increase based on the potential of those countries affected in terms of production, only production level, and this could be up to 6.5 billion in medium terms. But as you see, there are bars around these boxes that demonstrates the variability that could have been expected around these figures. And in scenario 5, which was a worst case scenario, this could have been from 2 billion up to more than 12 billion US dollars for the region. So production losses here account for 95% of losses because we only included production losses and we had not included the other type of losses here. And the 4 countries, based on their production impact, account for 80% of this economic damage. Additional impacts related to food and nutrition security could be expected, of course, but we didn't again enter to that quantification of those areas. And on the right-hand side, this is a simulated median and standard deviation of production losses that we expected in each of these countries. Next slide, please. So there are some challenges and limitations, as you noticed, and also broader application of this exercise. First of all, this was a simplified cost calculation. The method considered only mortality and the general impact on production, leaving out many direct and indirect factors. And also, in ideal situation for a good economic analysis, we would need to look at both let's say supply and demand side, and then the prices, the impact on prices in the market, which was not the case here. We only looked at partially at the production and supply side. And also the data limitation. Ideally, we need country or region-specific economic and epidemiological data, while country-specific production data are used here from FAO Stat, but still we had to make general epidemiological assumptions such as prevalence. So in lack of those information, this study needs to be considered with cautious. Next slide, please. Well, as I mentioned, ideally we would need both epidemiological and economic simulation models, such as we have in more advanced economies, to be able to have this kind of analysis in a more accurate way. And then you will face the issue of the lack of necessary data for those modeling work. Methods such as Monte Carlo simulation are proved to be very useful here, because you could at least cover those variability and uncertainty around figures that you have. But again, the validation of the data and assumptions becomes quite important. Consideration of prevention and control costs, we have not included in here. However, there's a potential to expand and include these costs into this cost calculation framework. Also, the adaptability of this model, it can be adapted to other TADs or other FMD, specifically in other regions, but then it needs to adapt the parameters to these diseases or areas of interest. So quickly going to conclusions and recommendations. An outbreak of FMD SAT2 would have a substantial negative impact, as we saw in those countries, though to a varying extent in terms of the level of impact and sector that feels mostly affected. The likelihood of exposure, infected and spread can vary over time or change seasonally, as we have seen, and as Melissa mentioned, for example, in Eid, such as Eid al-Adha or in winter and early spring, this risk may change. As resources are always limited, prevention should be risk-based. And as also the economic consideration mentions that, you need to consider risk-based, otherwise you are not efficiently using your resources to protecting the sectors that are more productive or more in danger. Next slide, please. Ensuring that only healthy animals, of course, known to be FMD-free, are moved. As you see in the right-hand side picture, there is a market, and how to make sure that your animal is free of the disease is quite crucial to mitigate the risk of FMD spread within and between countries. And as Melissa mentioned, again, there are countries in the region that so many exchange of animals happening among them, and it's very, very important to have this information. Trade between countries could be made safer by facilitating compliance with other official trade regulations, which in turn would help ensuring the sanitary measures are applied. Raising awareness, again, is very important to prevent FMD prevention and control in the regions, as many international organizations, including FAO, are working in this area to raise awareness among the countries who are at risk, and also different stakeholders involved in livestock productions. Next slide, please. All countries should have had an emergency response plan for FMD that details how to manage a sudden increase in cases, as we saw in case of SAT2. And this should be expected with the introduction of a novel serotype such as SAT2. That response plan needs to be realistic for each country. In this risk analysis, we tried to ask colleagues within the countries to provide specific information about risk in their countries. So this is quite important, and also supported with adequate resources for implementation whenever needed. And also these plans should be tested through regular and realistic simulation exercises. On the right-hand side, you see good emergency management practice essentials published by FAO, available for your information via that link. And also the alerts you see here that was coming out in February 2024 for the Mediterranean region for enhancing the preparedness for foot and mouth disease. Also, we should note that other type of SAT2 topotype mentioned, noticed elsewhere, for example, in Algeria in December 23, which shows that these information sharing is also quite important and also essential part of control against the new topotypes that arise. Next slide, please. Implements an early warning system based on reports of increased mortalities, particularly young stock is quite crucial. Again, in early warning and early detection of the disease, and of course subsequent actions. Observations at slaughterhouses and panic sales by using information from farmers, traders, paraveterinarian workers, and also inspectors, and relevant social media sites needs to be considered as very important. Support and improve the performance and infrastructure of veterinary services is considered as quite essential. And adopting public-private partnership approach when appropriate in the region. And we have previously seen in this region specifically, there are a number of successful PPPs that basically mobilizes the resources that is needed from both sides to tackle these emergencies. Next slide, please. I think this is our last slide. Melissa, please join me if I've forgotten to mention anything, but this qualitative risk assessment is considered as a useful framework to guide prevention and response activities, and adapting a WOHA framework for safe trade, for example, but challenge to do a true rapid risk assessment is important to consider. And also defining the risk question is a key step right at the beginning. And as we mentioned earlier, the risk is considered as probability of incursion multiplied by the impact. And this was an example of this kind of exercises that can be done. Although the results were communicated among countries, and it's available on FAO webpage and sent to all the stakeholders. However, we need feedback from the countries how useful this was for the risk managers across the region in every country, and also for a wider experts and communities who are involved in disease prevention and control. So with that, I'd like to thank you and for your attention. And I'd like to ask Melissa if you have any other comments to add at the end.
No, thanks. Thanks very much, Bouda. I'll hand it back to the moderator.
Thank you, Melissa and Bouda. Thank you so much. That was a really interesting and excellent presentation. We will now move on to the Q&A session. So I encourage all of our attendees, if you have a question, to please plug it in the Q&A box and we will facilitate it from there. Perhaps I could start with the first question. I noticed that you did not include buffalo in the study. Is there a particular reason why? I think you included the wild boar instead of the buffalo for the wildlife.
Well, in the region that we were focused on in West Eurasia and the Middle East, there's no wild buffalo that I'm aware of. So the buffalo there would be domestic water buffalo, which would have been included in some of the trade and production parameters when they're important in the countries. But in terms of wildlife, to my knowledge, there's no wild buffalo, and it would be the Asian water buffalo, of course, that would be the domesticated one.
The spread then of FMD. Okay.
Sorry? Yeah.
So they don't have any role in the spread of FMD, these water buffalo?
Well, similar to cattle, they would be susceptible and they would, be traded and perhaps move similar to cattle, but they wouldn't have a role in terms of the wildlife. Bouda, you're from the region. Do you have more water buffalo comments?
No, that's correct, Melissa. I don't think they are involved in epidemiological circulation of the virus, and they are more domestic, especially as far as I know, in the border of Iran and Pakistan, for example. But they are more domestic rather than wild buffaloes. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to hand over to Giselle, who will go through the next question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I have a question related to what Melissa you presented at the beginning. Should the time taken to identify the serotype of the outbreak also be considered as a critical factor in the risk analysis? Because how the delays in this serotype identification impact the overall response strategy?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, the delay in the detection is certainly a really important recommendation coming out. You know, we emphasized about the importance of an early warning system, about detecting increased number of cases, and then responding to those or trying to understand the reason for the increase, you know, would be really important to reduce the impact once there's an introduction. But that again maybe comes back a bit to the importance of defining that risk question. So we were asking about the likelihood of spread from already affected countries into unaffected countries. That was our very specific risk question. We weren't asking, once an animal is infected, how likely is it to spread? That would be, you know, a slightly different question, maybe that could be addressed more by the impact assessment. So it's extremely important and critical to mitigate the spread, but it wasn't directly in the likelihood assessment. But it is going to have an impact on, once it enters, how much spread and how big is the impact within those affected countries. I hope that that's a little bit clear. And I'll just continue for a moment, if you don't mind. I saw Satya's question in the chat about if we considered the risk or the likelihood of spread to India or to other countries. And the answer is the same, that it wasn't in the scope of the analysis. With that, you know, we just limited it to the borders, contiguous land borders with the known affected countries at the time of the assessment. And so we didn't consider countries beyond those 21 that were considered in the assessment. But hopefully, you know, that framework and those risk pathways would probably be relevant and could, you know, facilitate an extended analysis. But we didn't do that in the first instance.
Thank you, Melissa. Melanie?
Just to add to that, just a question: is the FAO looking into doing more of this kind of risk assessments, for example, for other regions like South Africa? We have this potential of the SAT2 incursion from Namibia. Are there other studies like this going to be ongoing?
Thanks, Melanie. And the short answer is yes, that the FAO sub-regional office in Southern Africa, SFS, is working on a risk assessment for the spread of the serotype O. We were at the roadmap meeting just last week in Tanzania, and had a chance to discuss that a little bit. And I see my colleague Wilmot, I think, has asked a question here, and he's the FAO colleague who's involved in conducting that risk assessment. So hopefully that will be forthcoming soon.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Over to you, Giselle.
We have a question from Alejandra Caposo. Are you aware of new tools to improve early detection of disease, like drones, air testing, etc., as part of and part for human direct communications? Is there a need for such a tool?
You want me to go, Bouda, or do you want to jump in?
No, go ahead. It's more your area,
Okay.
Melissa.
Thanks for the question, Alejandra. I mean, I think yes. You know, as I said before, the early detection is really key. But I think, you know, just detection isn't enough. As well as detection, we need that emergency response plan so that when there is a detection that the risk, can be mitigated. So I think, it's an open question that maybe we can discuss, going forwards about, of our resources, how much should be dedicated towards new tools and new methods compared to really optimizing the tools that we have. For example, in this meeting we were at last week, there's a real concern about just sample collection and transport to a laboratory. That's a real constraint and not done optimally in some countries, even though, all the laboratory methods are there to diagnose it. We still really need some basic improvements in capacity, just to get the samples, get them to the lab, get them diagnosed, and then to have an effective response. So I think, within the scientific community, this is an interesting question about how much we should focus on new tools versus optimizing the ones that we already have.
Thank you.
Okay. Our next question from Mohammed Abu Bakr. He says, nice presentation. He's just curious to know what regions are at risk from SAT2. FMD risk assessment from wildlife should be included. So I think you kind of answered this previously, but perhaps you could comment.
Sure. Yes. Thanks for the insight. And we did mention the wildlife were included in the assessment. And like I said, we focused mostly on the wild boars because of the particular region in which we were at. And you can see in the report and the matrix, which countries where the risk from wildlife was considered to be non-negligible. But compared to the other pathways, it was greater than 0. It was lesser than some of the other pathways. And in terms of which regions, again, we come down to the very narrow defined scope of this assessment. So we really just looked at those 21 countries and we can't comment on it beyond those 21 countries.
Thank you. Giselle?
Yes, our next question is from Fabrice Bantuseko from University of Nairobi. Wouldn't it be important to carry out trials on different farms and in different regions to determine the different impact of the disease on different breeds?
Bouda, I think that one's for you.
Well, thank you very much. This is an interesting question. I think this question has been around for many years, I would say. But I mean, given that usually experimenting with viruses are quite a risky business, I think, well, modeling work is much more preferred. It's less risky and it's more efficient in terms of using resources. And well, of course, there are limitations such as the need for reliable data. But generally speaking, looking at consequences, I think it's much more safer if we use economic modeling work. But if you are referring to the impact in terms of animal production, for example, I think again we can record the production and the impact on previous outbreaks and or ongoing outbreaks, and we can get an idea how the disease are damaging the production. And in that case, I think these are better approaches rather than experimenting with real disease on the farm. And there was another question, sorry, related to this. Maybe I just answered how feasible is to do risk-based control measures in countries that they have other priorities or resource limitation. In fact, this kind of risk assessment and the risk-based control measures are extremely important for countries who are in a situation that with very limited resources. Of course, there needs to be data collection, there needs to be participation in this kind of exercise, but absolutely crucial to be able to tackle diseases based on the risk-based approach, given the special distribution of the farms and the animals and the industries and productions, and also exchanges and trade. So there are so many elements that is already in this exercise that we presented, needs to be considered, but absolutely crucial.
Thank you. Melanie?
Okay, the next question is from Wilmot Chitlarunehe. He says, natural and man-made barriers, are these an important consideration in mitigating the risk? Of course, they would be part of the response plan.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Wilmot. I mean, I think the existence or absence of barriers are going to be important in understanding movements, you know, and the strength of connection between different countries or even within a country. So, you know, in terms of mitigating the risk of spread, if one part of a country is highly connected to another country, maybe you want to target your surveillance to that area of the country which is more highly connected and without any barriers. And in terms of movement controls, you can, or zoning, if you're considering a zoning approach, you can use those barriers to your advantage to try to mitigate the risk in a better way. You know, this assessment that we did, we were really focused on assessing the risk and not managing the risk. So it's not something that we looked at, but it's an important, you know, consideration, and how to make this type of analysis most useful to those people designing control and prevention strategies is something, you know, that I think we need to work on a little bit more going forwards.
Thank you. Giselle?
Thank you so much. I think we have reached the time. We still have at least 8 more questions. So we would like to thank the speakers for this fantastic presentation and everybody else for their participation this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, wherever you are in the world. Please stay tuned for their questions will be posted in the GFRA website, and we will announce the next webinar series. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much for having us. It was really great to have this platform to present. So thanks to everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much to our presenters, and thank you to everyone who joined. Again, as you leave the webinar, you'll be prompted to fill out a short survey. It should really only take a few minutes. If you can take a moment to fill that out, we would really appreciate it so we can continue working on improving this series. But yeah, stay tuned for the next webinar in this series. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.